As if learning basic tones wasn't enough, tones in Mandarin also influence each other and change depending on context. Some of these tone change rules you have to learn, but others are better left alone and will be absorbed naturally over time. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to talk about tone change rules in Mandarin, and as I said in the introduction, you not only have to learn basic tones, you also need to learn that some tones change in context. There is a certain amount of confusion about this, and I remember being confused myself, and that is because there are two types of tone change rules and you need to approach them differently, which is what I will talk about in this episode. Before we do that though, I'd like to say that my pronunciation course is now open for registration, and it will stay open until midnight on Friday, that's May 13th. This is a video course that covers everything related to pronunciation, including initials, finals, tones, prosody, and so on, and it's suitable for both beginners and more advanced students. If you want to know more about the course, head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com or check the link in the description. If you listen to this podcast episode after May 13th, you will be able to leave your email address so that I can notify you when the course opens again. With that out of the way, let's talk about tone change rules in Mandarin. As the title of this episode implies, there are two different types that we need to talk about. The first is obligatory tone change rules, and the second is optional tone change rules. And it should be fairly obvious what that means just based on the names I used, but just to be clear, obligatory rules are rules that you have to apply. If you don't apply them, it will be wrong, and native speakers will almost never pronounce it like this. So it's essentially something you have to do, and if you don't do it, it will sound very awkward or even wrong. I will discuss all these obligatory rules in a bit, but just to show you what I mean, an example would be two third tones in a row, so ni hao. You have to go up on the first syllable, you cannot say ni hao, or you can but nobody else does, so it would be considered wrong. The second type of rule is optional rules, and those, as the name implies, are something you don't have to apply, so if you don't do it, you won't be wrong. It might sound a little bit unnatural sometimes, and most native speakers might apply these rules in specific contexts, especially when the rate of speech is fairly high. But if you don't do it, you won't be wrong, and you can safely ignore them if you want. An example of this might be two fourth tones in a row, and those are rarely pronounced as two full fourth tones. An example might be 但是, which means but or however, and it's rarely pronounced as 但是, with two full fourth tones falling all the way from the highest pitch to the lowest. Instead, the fall is spread out over both syllables, so the first one doesn't fall all the way to the bottom, and the second one sometimes doesn't start at the very top. And if you take a recording of a word like 但是 produced in natural speech, you will find that the pitch doesn't necessarily match what you'd expect from having two full fourth tones. The point I want to make in this episode is that your approach to these types of tone change rules are quite different. In the case of obligatory tone change rules, these are things you really have to do, and you have to learn them and make sure that you're pronouncing things correctly from the start. It will be very hard to change later. Whereas the optional tone change rules are not something you really have to pay much attention to, especially not as a beginner. And sometimes these are introduced in textbooks or teachers mention them, and the only result is that students get even more confused. Instead, you can actually largely ignore these. It's nice to know that they're there, but if you speak Chinese and you speak lots of Chinese to the point where you will start speaking more quickly, you will make these changes automatically, and even if you don't, it's not really a big problem. But let's start from the basics and go through the obligatory tone change rules. So this is for those of you who have started recently or are not sure about exactly which rules you have to apply. So the first rule, or maybe it's a set of rules, pertains to the third tone and how it is influenced by other tones around it. This is something I discussed at great length in episode 26 of the podcast, so I won't say too much about it here, but I will put a link in the description for those of you who want to know more. But if we assume that the third tone is a low tone, what you need to remember is that if you have two third tones in a row, the first will turn into a rising tone, as in ni hao. You also need to know that there is a dipping variant that is used when the tone is heavily emphasized or when it's in isolation, such as when saying hao, but that this is rather unusual in natural speech. If you were taught that the third tone is a dipping tone, you also need to know that in front of a first, second, or fourth tone, the third tone changes into a low tone. If this was too much information in too little time, check out episode 26. Next up, we have tone change for the character E, and it is normally a first tone, E, but in front of a first, second, or third tone, it turns into a fourth tone, such as in ichi, together. And in front of a fourth tone, it turns into a second tone, such as in yang, the same. It's also worth noting that E retains the first tone when it's used as an ordinal number, such as when saying the number X, for example in 第一年, as in the first year. It's still a first tone there. Next up, we have the character bu, that acts the same way as E does, except that it is a fourth tone from the very start. That means that it remains a fourth tone in most cases, and you just need to remember that when it comes in front of another fourth tone, it changes to a second tone, just like E does. The last example of this kind is the neutral tone, which is really a different kind of tone change, but it's still worth noting that the neutral tone is pronounced differently in different contexts. Indeed, that's part of the definition of what the neutral tone is, i.e. that it's not pronounced with its original tone, but instead gets its pitch from the surrounding tones or from intonation. The general rule you can use is that the neutral tone is slightly lower than the preceding tone, except when it's a low tone that comes before it, because then it's a high tone, such as in 好了, the l here is high, whereas in cases like 开了, 来了, and 算了, it is as low or lower than the end of the preceding tone. This is enough detail for now, I think, but for those of you who are interested, this is of course something that I do cover in the pronunciation course. Let's move on to the optional tone change rules. And remember, these are rules you don't have to apply, but native speakers usually do when they speak quickly. There isn't a fixed set of rules here, because it depends a little bit on context, who is talking, and so on and so forth, so I won't try to list all the optional tone change rules if that were even possible, but I will list some of the more important ones that you should be aware of at least. The first one we already looked at, and that is when you have two fourth tones in a row and you kind of spread out the fall across the two syllables, or at least the first syllable starts high but then doesn't fall all the way. The next example is when you have several consecutive second tones in a row, and I'm going to look at 3 consecutive second tones here. And my name is a good example, I mentioned this on the podcast before, but my Chinese name is Ling Yun Long. And like you might have noticed, it sounds a little bit unnatural to say 3 second tones in a row like that, and that's why most native speakers don't do it when they speak quickly. Instead, it's very common to turn the middle tone into a first tone. So that means that my name will come out as Ling Yun Long. That's Ling Yun Long. Although, of course, nobody will say it like that when they enunciate every syllable, because then it's just wrong. But when you speak quickly, it's hard to say these 3 tones in a row, and so people don't. And of course, this is not limited to my name, I just use that as an example. The third and final example I want to bring up is when a second tone is stuck between a first tone and another tone, usually a first tone or a second tone. For example, we have 一年级, which means grade 1 in school. So here we have a first tone, 一. Remember, it's an ordinal number. We have grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So it retains the first tone here, 一. Then we have a second tone, 年, and then another second tone, 级. So the middle tone here can vary a bit and turn into a first tone. So instead of saying 年, it turns into 年. So the whole phrase would be 一年级. So that's 一年级. And of course, it sounds wrong when I say it slowly like that, but changes like these are rather common when native speakers talk, and it's good to be aware of it, if nothing else so that you can understand why they are saying things in a slightly different way than you were taught in your textbook. Still, just to make that clear, you don't have to do these things deliberately, or I would say indeed you shouldn't even try to. Just focus on speaking more, listening, mimicking, and these changes will probably sneak in automatically without you even noticing. If this is the first you hear about these optional rules, then don't freak out, just pay attention and see if you can hear people saying these things. It's a good exercise, but there is no reason for you to spend time and energy trying to practice this yourself. There are so many other things of pronunciation you should learn first, and like I said, it's likely that this will come naturally with time anyway. Before wrapping up this episode, I would like to say something about a similar phenomenon which is not related to tones, so it might be a little bit easier to understand. Or maybe not, but we'll see. The problem is, of course, that tones are not intuitive to people who come from languages that don't have tones the way Mandarin does. But the idea that sounds in languages influence each other and that a sound can be pronounced differently in different contexts is, of course, well established, and that goes for English as well, naturally. These things can be rather difficult to discuss sometimes because we are typically not aware of how we pronounce our native languages, unless we've studied phonetics, which I assume that most listeners haven't. Let's talk about an example that is shared between both Mandarin and English, and this is an example of assimilation, and assimilation is when two sounds are pronounced more closely than they are when they are in isolation. And this is usually the consequence of rapid speech, because of course pronouncing sounds that are very different is harder than pronouncing sounds that are very close, so we tend to make the sounds closer than they would be in other contexts. So let's start with the word mianbao in Mandarin, that's bread, mianbao. Say that a few times to yourself. So say it a few more times and try to pay attention to the middle where the two syllables meet. Of course, I cannot hear what you are saying, and it depends on how much you've studied Chinese and how quickly you said it and so on. But what happens usually is that the N at the end of mian turns into an M instead. That is because the first sound in the second syllable is a B, and that is a bilabial plosive. It's pronounced with both lips. And guess what? M is also pronounced with both lips, so it's much easier to say M and B together than it is to say N and B. So if you say mian bao, that is rather hard, but if you say mian bao, that's pretty easy and it flows much more naturally. And of course, when you say it very slowly like I did, you don't have to do that. But if you say the word quickly, or if native speakers say the word quickly, it's very likely that they will actually say an M in the middle here instead of an N. So mianbao. This often happens in English as well. So if we have a word like input, for example, it's spelled I-N-P-U-T, but it's often pronounced as I-M-P-U-T. So input rather than input. Now, like I said, this is rather hard to talk about because unless you've thought about these things or studied phonetics, it's sometimes very hard to analyze your own pronunciation in this way. We tend to be blinded by how things are spelt rather than how they are actually pronounced, and since you see an N on the page, it's very hard to accept that an N is usually pronounced as an M. And if you check the comments to the article that goes with this podcast episode on hacking Chinese, you will see that many people don't agree with this. They say that they definitely say input all the time. And of course, I don't know how every single English speaker pronounces this word. I'm just saying that it is a well-documented example of assimilation in English, that N and P turn into M and P, because it's simply easier to pronounce when you speak quickly. The reason I brought this up is that I wanted to show that sounds influencing each other, like the tones we've talked about in this episode, is rather common and it happens all the time in all languages. Now, if you're an English teacher or if you would ponder teaching your native language for a second, even if you're not a teacher, I think we can all agree that teaching things like the NP turning into MP is rather a waste of time. There are many other things that most foreigners should think about before considering things like this, and you could argue that it's only interesting if you're really into phonetics. And this is true for the optional tone change rules I mentioned in this episode too. You don't have to learn them, and if you've never heard about them, that's fine. But if you are interested and if you've noticed that people actually don't really say things exactly like you've learned in your textbook, this is why, and maybe that can make you sleep better at night, or at least stop thinking that there's something wrong with your ears or that you perceive tones differently from everybody else. I think that's enough about tones and tone change rules for one episode, and if you want more of this and other things related to pronunciation, my course is open until May 13th, so check it out at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.